Hello, I'm Cient here, and today I want to talk about the original sort of topic that I had was faith in games, but as I thought about it, I kind of realized it makes more sense to kind of split it into multiple things. And when I say faith in games, what I'm talking about is sort of the implementation or approach that is taken to basically religious and supernatural entities, objects of worship, that sort of thing, in video games. So I am, as anybody who's followed the channel for a week probably has noticed, a religious individual, seeing as I make a show entirely about that, and called Geekdom of God. And I was reflecting the other day about how faith in games is usually represented through a stat or something like that. I'm particularly thinking of like Dark Souls. The Dark Souls games is what was immediately triggering the thought. But that sort of statistic-based thing is not necessarily consistent with my experience in so much as, like, it can work. But anyway, that's a thing I'll get to probably tangentially. So this is probably going to be kind of a two-parter. Maybe I'll spawn more parts later if there's interest. But what I want to talk about today is specifically deities, or gods, or whatever you want to call them. I'll probably call them deities, just because that's kind of the term that I prefer for just kind of a catch-all. But I often feel like the approach can be a little distant with how creators work on these things. So as both a fan of video games and game design, as well as world building and a religious individual, this is something that I've thought about a lot, and about how deities kind of should work and things like that. So there's a couple of, I think, really important fundamental questions. First of all, when we're creating some sort of deity as a world builder, we have to ask the question of whether or not this is a real deity. Because, like, Christians, for example, believe that there's a lot of false deities that people believe in. And most religions will sort of make some amount of claim of that there's false deities. But people still believe in them, right? There's still people that hold that they're not false deities. And so you have this contention. So it's totally reasonable to say, in a fictional setting, that, you know, this is something that these people believe in that's not actually a real thing, or something might be impersonating it, or whatever. So that's totally reasonable. However, and you do have to think about, like, how that's going to affect the culture. But a lot of the influence that way would be like how the religion affects society and molds people, and, you know, it's a lot of ideological and that sort of thing. Of course, there will probably always be dissenters. Like, we've had dissenters for a very long time of any given religion. Sometimes that goes less well for them, and sometimes they just hide it. But you have people who are true believers and people who just go along because that's kind of what the culture is. Then you have people who dissent, and so all sorts of different things there. But I think it's more interesting to kind of think about, what if the deity is real, right? And how does that influence things? I think it's really important to kind of spend some time and think about who your deity or deities is or are, whatever makes the grammar work there. Because these are characters. They are individuals that have most likely a huge impact on your setting. So they should be rounded characters. They should be fleshed out. They should have motivations, wants, and desires and goals. They should be trying to accomplish something. They should be, because logically, if they're not really a deity, then maybe not, but logically, because they're a deity, they have some amount of power. They can have some amount of influence in the world. So this is really important to understand, because it determines how they are being interacted with, how they want to be interacted with, what they respond to, what they don't respond to, how they're related to, and all of that sort of stuff, how they want to relate. I think there's also other questions to ask. So things like, is this a created world? And if so, how are the deities involved in this? If it's not a created world, and what I mean is, did some sort of supernatural power create your universe? It's kind of like, if we're going real far, this is not something that's typically done in world building, by the way. World building, at least from what I've seen, usually doesn't have creation mythos attached to it. Lord of the Rings does. Like, there is creation mythos for Middle Earth, with the Iluvatar and all of that. Anybody who's read the Silmarillion, it starts off, I mean, it's very sort of biblical in its crafting. And a lot of real-world mythology does involve creation myths, right? It has a way of, how did existence come to be? But I think, at least from what is presented to me, with what I've experienced in games, a lot of the world building does not involve creation myth. Like even Dark Souls does not involve creation myth. It just starts with origin of life and that sort of thing, right? Where did the gray come from? Or is never established. So a lot of world building, in my experience, does not include any sort of creation. If it's not a created world, if it's just like somehow come about or otherwise, however you think that the world came to be, how are the deities, things that are there, how are they involved? How do they come to be? And all that sort of stuff is, I think, an important question to ask. But yeah, you need to ask, like, what do they want? What are their motivations? Do they grant power to perform miracles to their followers? And if so, why? Like, what are they trying to accomplish? What are their goals with granting power to perform miracles? How are the miracles performed? Is it, like... Because the thing is, it's really easy to just kind of, like, make some abstract domain that's, like, the energy of fire. I don't know. And you call it some sort of deity, but really all it is they use a faith stat to channel fire from this fire source to be able to do fire instead of using some sort of like intelligence stat or whatever. I have an entirely separate discussion about intelligence and all of that sort of stuff. Probably should be a knowledge stat instead of an intelligence stat or some sort of arcane knowledge or something, but that's an entirely different discussion. So there's other questions as well, like, do the deities have a physical manifestation? Do they physically manifest? If so, is it something they do a lot? Is it rare? Like, how often does that happen? And that sort of thing. And is there a special place where the deities reside? Right? That's an important question. Like, is there a home that they have? Do they kind of, like, drift around the world? Are they spiritual beings, physical beings? Like, for example... Christians, because this is my experience, right? Christians believe that God is a spiritual being who physically manifests in the form of Jesus Christ by getting some teenage girl pregnant with his almighty power, and then, you know, all that sort of stuff. So that would be a physical manifestation, but it's very rare. Whereas you have things like angels, for example, are described as like spiritual beings that are able to physically manifest or something. It's a little ambiguous. But there's all of this sort of stuff of like, how common is this sort of thing? Where do they dwell? And all that sort of stuff. And then also, like, how do the deities interact with death? How, like, is there a place where people live when they die? Is there some sort of judgment? All that sort of stuff. That stuff tends to get addressed a little bit more, but it also tends to be very hand-wavy. And the goal of all of this sort of processing and thinking is that I think it creates a certain sort of strength to the world. And, like, if a deity is clearly and provably having an interaction in the world, rather than... Because, like, there can be different levels of interaction, right? You can have a deity that's very active, but very subtle in their interaction. And so, like, the Christian point of view, again, my frame of reference, would be that God can perform supernatural miracles, but more often he works in subtle ways, influences natural events, things like that, where rather than acting in overt sort of miraculous ways, it's more like what he's doing is stacking the deck or manipulating sort of how things, kind of the luck of the draw, or how things kind of come out, right? Where there isn't a coincidence, there's providence, right? And there's kind of that perspective on things. So it totally makes sense to have a deity work that way. But if so, why are they working that way? What is their goal with working that way? Versus, like, a more overt deity. Maybe you have a deity that's, like, super flashy or something. And, like, but then people are going to know about this person. What are they doing? How are they getting worshipped? Why are they getting worshipped? These are really important questions, too. Like, the nature of worship is kind of relying on and invoking on and invoking the name of this being. And invoking the name of it means kind of you're calling to it to do specific things. Like, why would people do that with a particular created deity that you have in your setting, right? So there's a whole pile of things. And, like, a really good question is, if somebody is denying a deity that is very overt in their action, why are they doing it? What leads to that motivation? If there's a group or a community that does that, why are they doing that? Right? It's kind of hard to deny a deity that everyone who follows them is, you know, able to do miracles. that's kind of hard to ignore, but what does it mean? Like, why wouldn't people, do what they can? And there's a lot of stuff there that can be worked with. So what I'm saying with all of this is that I think it's really important when doing world building, if you're going to have deities in your setting and they're going to be real, that you need to figure out who they are and what they're doing and what their impact and influence on the world is, what their relationship with the world is, what their relationship with believers is, whether or not anyone does believe in them, and if not, why not, and all sorts of stuff that way. Because I think it will make a fuller and more complete setting, and I think it will lend logic and credence to why the world works the way that it does. So think about, like, if you have, miracles, why do miracles work? Right? And is it basically like calling on divine power to do this thing? Is there some sort of localized connection? Again, going back to Christianity, Christians believe that they've been given the Holy Spirit. That is, some aspect of God, or God himself, lives inside each individual Christian. Like, that's a significant thing, but that's something that is a concept that you could somehow make use of, right, in world building. And so there could be something there where it's like there's some sort of fusion at the spirit level, fusion that sort of thing. Good old Dragon Ball Z references. But there could be something that's done there. And so, like, there's different angles to try to approach this, and what is divine power and the nature of that sort of thing as well. Well, it's like, I think of it, for example, as authority, as the ability to command the natural elements to obey your will. So things like commanding fire to appear or whatever, like that could be accomplished through commanding heat to congregate in an area. That might make surrounding areas colder in response or whatever. So anyway, those are just some ideas, some stuff that I've been thinking about when it comes to world building with deities and all of that sort of thing, which, again, I think it's a really interesting topic. I really would like to see stuff that involves deities, for example, and I don't play Dungeons and Dragons. I've only seen some play of it, so I don't know how well developed the deities in that are or not, but those sorts of settings, or things like that, where there's a lot of attention given to the deities, how they operate, what significance they have, what relationships they have with things, and really fleshing them out as characters. And you can make them as human or as unhuman, as makes sense for the setting, but just think about how their influence will affect the world, and what they want, what they're trying to accomplish, and all of those sorts of things, what their power level is as well. Because, like, you have the Greco-Roman deities, which are, real powerful, but then you have, like, the Christian God is all-powerful, right? And there's a difference between super-duper powerful and literally controls everything, or can control everything, right? Has all power. And, like, there's a huge gap between that all the way down to, like, nature spirits and things like that, which tend to be much lower power level. So just a lot of stuff to think about. And I'm going to, next time, get into religion, which is a really important aspect as well. So that's going to be the next episode. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one up. And until that next time, if you're listening then, and until next time, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.